Welcome to What's Your Story podcast. I'm your host, Matt Story. On this pod, I sit down with people of color leaders to understand how they've been able to use their superpowers to make an impact on our world. And I do it one story at a time. My guest on the pod this week is a treat. He's an author, speaker, teacher, and advisor with over four decades of experience specializing in helping people, organizations, and teams reinvent themselves to remain relevant in changing times, which we all could really use right now. And he's a living legend of the marketing industry with many innovation and lifetime achievement recognitions from the likes of Time, Business Week, and Ad Age, to name a few. And I'm really looking forward to reconnecting and hearing more about his story. So please welcome Rishad Tobaccowala to the show.
Matt, thank you for having me on the show, and it's good to reconnect. And something you may want people to forget is you and I used to work together once upon a time.
Yes, I was going to get to that eventually, but yes, that is. I will tell you more about that if we get to that part of your story. But appreciate you taking the time, jumping on the mic, and helping me out. We were just talking about you have quite a bit of travel coming up, so I'm glad we were able to sneak this in. But before we get into all the great things you've been able to do and experience and touch throughout your journey, I'm curious if you could take us back and maybe tell us a story about little Rishad.
Little Rishad grew up in a city called Bombay, which is now renamed to Mumbai, India. But I was born in Bombay, and I grew up in the main city, and I went to a Jesuit school, sort of, that eventually became a Jesuit high school. Then I went to a Jesuit college. My father was a Muslim. My mother was a Hindu. They worked for a Zoroastrian company. They sent me to Jesuit school. It's kind of interesting. I'd go to church, and I'd go to temple, and I'd go to mosque. And I think the lesson there was pay attention and respect all of them, but recognize that there's more than one way of seeing the world.
Did you have an idea of what you wanted to be when you grew up back then?
Yes. So in my very early career, by the time I was like a teenager, so I was starting to think about stuff. I wanted to be a writer, and I started writing, little short stories and little things. But I was dissuaded from being a writer by my parents, who said two things. One is, yes, you're a good writer, but you're too young and you don't have much to say. So why don't you learn a few things? Then you'll have something interesting to say. Okay. And the second is that it would be very difficult to make a living as a writer. And the third, which is kind of interesting, is that since it's a passion, I think you'll figure out how to keep doing it regardless of what else you do.
Yeah.
And so I ended up actually doing the exact opposite of writing, if there is an opposite of writing, which is I spent 4 years in college doing advanced mathematics. Okay, which is, some way of thinking about it is there's writing and arithmetic. And so I guess I was doing the arithmetic part of it. But that's what I ended up doing. I got a degree in mathematics from the University of Bombay. And I then came to the University of Chicago for an MBA in 1980. And I graduated from there in 1982. And by which time I was, I think, 22 years old. And I was no longer little Rishad. But I had a math degree, I had a finance degree, and I managed to get one job. And that's how it started.
Well, one, I love that your parents' advice was spot on, and they were right. And two, that you ultimately became that writer.
Yes. So in fact, I dedicated my first book to them. And fortunately, they lived to a good age, but they both passed away before. They were both in their 80s. And so they did not get to see my book. But, they'd always said you will write one. And so I've written one. I'm now finishing my second, which will also be published by HarperCollins. And now I've learned in January of 25 versus fall of 24. They want to avoid the election. So Jan of 2025. And I obviously write the Substack that you read. So yes, I ended up becoming a writer. And in fact, today when people ask me, what do you do? I say, I'm an author.
So I do want to jump into your professional journey. And usually I start at the beginning and work forward, but actually with you, I want to work backwards.
Sure.
And have you kind of walk through some of the chapters. So you spent early 4 decades at Publicis Group, which for those that aren't familiar, it's a 80,000 employee firm dedicated to delivering marketing and business transformation. Was it always the plan to spend that much time with one firm?
No, it was the original plan was to get a green card because the only person or company that gave me a job was Leo Burnett when I graduated in 1982. And the reason was probably because I was useless, but in most cases, I was not eligible because companies could not hire people without a work permit.
Hmm.
And I was legal, but I had a 1 year training visa. That's all. So
Hmm.
after 1 year, they would have to pay for me to convert. And you couldn't necessarily be sure that the person would convert. And so the idea of hiring somebody who you may need to keep, could only keep potentially for a year, you would definitely have to invest money to keep them, right? Versus some other person you could get who was probably equally good without that problem, uh, was the big constraint. So I said, okay, I'll get my green card, which was my permanent resident, will allow me to work anywhere I want and live everywhere I want. And then I figure it out. And I did get that green card in about 3 to 4 years.
Hmm.
Uh, and I never left. And I literally look back, and there are three reasons for why I never left. And all of them are actually true, even though the first one sounds unbelievable. It is absolutely unbelievable, but it is true. No one ever made me a job offer in my 37 years from the outside world. Not once. Not once. Okay. Any real job offer besides like having a dinner or lunch? Not once. So that is a problem. So one is I couldn't go anywhere because nobody offered. And it's true. People refuse to believe it. Okay. The second is that I had a sense of not of both loyalty to people who took a chance on me. And I said, like, I just can't like leave now. But I could have stayed 3, 4 years. I have to stay 30 or 35 or 37. But as importantly, it was the third reason, which is while I stayed in the same place or looked like the same place, which is maybe often even the same building in Chicago, I carried and I've actually counted 14 different business cards
Hmm.
over my 37 years. And when I say 14 different business cards, I do not mean different titles or the name of the same company with a new logo.
Mm-hmm.
These are 14 different firms, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the company I joined, which was Leo Burnett, which I joined in 1982, the last time I carried a Leo Burnett card was 1993. I stopped working full time at Publicis at 2019. So for 27 of my 37 years, I wasn't even working at the company I joined on
Mm-hmm.
paper, Leo Burnett.
Mm-hmm.
And, we worked together in companies like Starcom IP, and I was in Starcom and MediaWest and GM Planworks, and I was obviously at Publicis and Viveki, and I was a chair of Digitas and Razorfish, and we launched things like Denu. So
Mm-hmm.
there were 14 different companies. So I ended up actually changing companies, changing industries, changing all kinds of things, but staying in the same place.
Yeah.
So those are the three reasons, I guess, where someone looking at my background thinks I'm changing jobs every 3, 4 years, and I probably have a more varied background around the world than most people. But it's also very true. He started in a building, he finished in a building in the same company for 37 years.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting thinking of that varied background. I don't think there's a part of marketing or marketing strategy that you didn't touch.
Right.
And so I'm curious, how did you think about or how did you approach expanding your skill set or capabilities? Because, it's not like you were a engineer and it's just programming
Right.
is programming. Like literally the world was changing under you. So how
Yeah.
did you think about staying fresh, staying new, knowing where things were going?
Well, in hindsight, I think there were three things that did happen. The first is I was given certain opportunities and chances that at that time probably was terrifying, but I said yes. So initially, I was given the opportunity to, when I was at sort of Leo Burnett, is I was given the opportunity to pitch on for a sort of to work. The only way to get promoted was to work in direct marketing. So I said, yes, fine. If I get promoted, I'll work in direct marketing. And direct marketing was very different. It was postage and A/B testing and paper stock, not television commercials in LA. So
Mm,
it was very non-glamorous, and people said like, "What are you doing?" Right?
mhm,
And so my thing is, hey, I can get promoted, so I'm going to do it. And I actually, while I was doing it, I began to realize that the principles of direct marketing made a lot of sense, but the financial economics were hobbled by the need to buy postage stamps or mail and find people with lists which you bought from Cat Fancy or something else and mail it. And that's how I discovered things like Prodigy, CompuServe, and AOL.
mm,
And I said, I think I can do direct marketing, but without the paper stock and without finding the audience the way I did it the old way. And that helped me launch the interactive marketing group, where I actually, partnered with a couple of brothers who actually knew programming, and we created Giant Step.
mm,
And it was the first time I got Leo Burnett to take the name off the door. We left the building. We stayed in a loft. I learned how to manage real P&Ls, real cash flow, real bank accounts, right?
yep.
And that was great. And so that was part of it. But then I sort of came back and did other key things. Like I launched, I helped Jack Clues and other people launch Starcom from Leo Burnett.
Mhm,
And so every time what I did was I followed a few things. And these are the ones that I would recommend. One is obviously I was given the opportunity and I took it. So one of the things I always say is raise your hand. Don't put your hand down,
mhm,
right? Second is I followed a trend. While I was fearful, I looked ahead and I said, is this likely to be a growing part of the world of marketing or a dying part of the world of marketing? And my thought was unbundled media, digital targeting, quantitative stuff is likely to be a bigger part of marketing. So let me learn about that. So that's the
mhm,
second one. And the third one, and this is the hardest part for most people, is to recognize that you have a very long career. And if you aren't replenishing and reinventing yourself, and this was true when things were even slower, but now it's moving faster, you will be past your sell by date long before you'll be retired.
mhm,
Right. And
yep.
so people say, well, I'll retire before this thing happens. Well, no, that's not going to happen.
No.
So, one is keep reinventing, second is take chances, and third is align with the force.
Well, as you mentioned, I was one of the folks that really benefited from your vision and your leadership of helping clients see around corners.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I took away from you as a leader is you focus specifically on acquiring diverse talent
Yes.
and diverse in all ways, diverse in
Yes.
backgrounds, experiences, even the way they approach things. So I'm curious, why was and you were doing it at a time where no one else was talking about, it, no one else was doing it. So I'm curious, why was that important to you?
Two or three reasons it was important. The first reason it was very important, first was diversity of background and diversity of cultures was important because I was an immigrant to this country. And I basically began to realize that I was learning a lot from people who grew up in this country and who grew up with different backgrounds, but they could also learn from me. So I knew I was learning from them because they were giving me different perspectives than the perspectives that I may have grown up in India. On the other hand, my whole thing is I'm going to learn about your world, but there's a world I come from that you can learn too. And
Mhm,
basically, what I began to realize that creativity is connecting dots in new ways. So if you have people who have lots of different dots in their background, that helps. That's number one.
mhm,
So it was basically, hey, I look at things from an outsider in a different perspective. I should surround myself with others in that. But the second one, and I think the second and third ones are the ones that I pulled off particularly well, which is another two forms of diversity. So the first one is very important: diversity of background, diversity of culture, ethnicity, all of that.
mhm,
But the second one, which is after you do that, is diversity of thinking. You can have different backgrounds, but they could think the same way. So
mhm,
at some particular stage, especially if you are strange, so as you know, our boss, Jack Lewis, would often say, hey, Rishad, you're running the land of misfit toys.
mhm,
Okay. They were like really strange people. You reported to some of those, right? And they are now legends in the industry in their own. But they were highly questionable and suspect. Okay. But what tended to basically happen is what I saw that what I didn't see the suspect. I saw their passion and excellence to do things,
Mm-hmm.
right? So my stuff is okay. They're a little weirdo, but that's okay. But they're respectful. They're nice to other people. And my God, they have this burning passion to do this stuff. So let's figure that out.
Mm-hmm.
But the third one, and this one, today, some people find harder to do. And obviously, you have to be a little bit more sensitive than have you ever been before. Not that you never have to be sensitive, is diversity of voices. Okay. So you have diversity of backgrounds, you have diversity of thinking, but then you have diversity of voices. And what I mean by diversity of voices, as you know only too well, how many of you all would come charging into my office and say, "Stop, you idiot, you don't know what you're doing." Okay. And I was going to have the most senior person around. And I was like taken aside and said,
Yeah.
"Don't say this stuff. You don't know what you're talking about. Let us tell you what you're supposed to be saying." Okay. And this was like, and I'd of course tell people back, like, "What is wrong with you?" Okay. And so it was a back and forth. There was no bullying. There was no, any form of racism, sexism, ageism, none of that. But it was like, let the ideas rule. Everybody understood that you aren't supposed to do anything that is like that. But on the other hand, feel free to speak up and say stuff, right?
Yeah.
Not against a person, but against an idea. Challenge an idea, right? Including challenge an idea which you think might be interesting. So those were the three that helped me a lot. And what it did is it did something that even today people don't understand, which is I would say if I have two skills, or I had two skills, maybe I got zero left now, but I had two. One of them was the ability to sort of look at the dots of yesterday and look ahead, which is peer around corners, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the really big one was, how do I get people who are world class to work together to actually deliver around the corners? Not
Yeah.
I could peer, but peering is not enough. Someone's got to
Yeah.
go around and get the thing done. And these people, interestingly, the weirdos or whatever they were called, were the most talented. So I got the disproportionate share of talent, because what people were not looking at was their burning talent and their excellence. They were basically looking, hey, these people look different, speak different. And my whole thing, that's all perfectly fine as long as they basically put on deodorant. That doesn't matter. Let's get together and they're nice to each other, respectful. Let's go.
Yeah.
And those two things are very important in the world we're moving into, because what's a company? It's nothing but a disproportionate share of talent passionately aligned against a common outcome, very much like world-class teams, sports teams.
Yeah. No, I can't say enough about the special sauce you created on those teams. And you replicated it, because it wasn't just like you did it once and got lucky. Like, you were able to replicate that and pass that through the organization in a way that even the smaller teams were able to replicate it.
And everybody replicated. And now if you notice, all the people around, because now they're very senior everywhere, they've got teams.
Exactly.
Right? And I said, aha. And some of them, I can see them using some of the things that they picked up. But many of y'all then did what anybody would do. Y'all did it even better. Okay.
Yeah,
and so then at some particular stage, my whole stuff is, oh shit, I better learn from that now.
Yes. And I can't appreciate enough. And it's funny because during it, I don't know that I realized how special it was. Yep. It was, as you said, we were passionate. We were big ideas. How do we execute this? How do we get to the next thing? But as I went on and looking back at that time, like that, it was a special time, special teams that.
So a lot of people basically always say, hey, the teams that I had working with me, and this is like a very old musical, which most people have never seen. It's called Camelot. Okay. Mm-hmm. And in Camelot, there's a song that says, there once was this amazing spot, this brief shining moment. It's Camelot, right? Mm-hmm. And so to a certain extent, they say sometimes that about the Kennedy administration, right? But what tended to basically happen, people said, we didn't know we were in Camelot till we left.
Yep.
Okay. 100%. And because the other thing what most people didn't realize is, while all of that was happening, we were also growing and delivering great financial results. So that was the key thing. This wasn't like a spa that we were running.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Right. So speaking of skills that you now have, I would classify you as a creator. I don't know if you'd call yourself a creator, but given you run a podcast, you have a Substack, regularly putting out content. One question is, do you think of yourself as a creator?
I would like to be considered a creator. So here's a big belief I now speak to people who are senior, like yourself and others. And part of it is I remind them that one of the reasons they sometimes have difficulty with the people who, on paper, they're supposed to be reporting to, is I say, we've entered the age of debossification.
Mm.
Nobody wants a boss. And so, what your talent is asking you is, what do you do, sir? Or what do you do, madam? Okay.
Yep.
And if you're saying that your job primarily is to allocate, delegate, and monitor, they'll say that's not a job. What they basically say is, what are you making, creating, or building?
Mm.
So I often basically say, if you aren't making, creating, or building, I don't understand what you're doing.
Mm.
So it's one of the reasons I like being called a creator, because otherwise people will call me a bullshitter only. So now I can basically say, okay, I'm just creating stuff. But I do. And what tended to happen is, and creating, obviously in this case, is like content and products, etc. But what I'm also doing is I continue to help other management and a lot of leaders create cultures. I don't create the culture, but I now become a catalyst to help them create cultures. And for me, great cultures are a combination of excellence and a growth mindset and
Mm-hmm.
communication and collaboration. And those are the four keys. And so I'm working with people on how they can build, because I remind people what you're remembered by is not what you monitored, allocated, and delegated. It's by what you created, built, and made. And that could also basically be helping architect and hone the next generation of leaders. It doesn't have to be a thing. It doesn't have to be
Yeah.
about you. It can be something else.
You just sparked an idea or a question that I've been thinking a lot about. And as you were saying, the debossification
Right.
of the workforce, as we move into a space where people are going to have a portfolio within their career, they're not just going to have one thing they do, they're going to
Yep.
have multiple things. Fast forward 5 years, 10 years, like how do you think we as organizations, we as bosses, or need to change how we work to be able to get that new talent? Because it's not going to look like the talent from 10 years ago.
I'll give you two or three thoughts about it, but in Jan of 2024, I'll come back and you can promote my book.
Nice.
So my book, which is called Rethinking Work, that's what it's titled. But because it's HarperCollins and I've gone through one escapade with them, they do research and they do all kinds of stuff. Who knows what it'll be called? But with that being said, right now it's what they bought was Rethinking Work, and that's what I'm writing, or I've almost finished writing. So the opening of the book is very much based on your premise, which is, let's look at the changing demographics. Okay. And I just will share three numbers with you, of many numbers that I share. And these are the three that actually blows people's minds,
Mm-hmm.
right? So one is a number that a lot of people are aware of, which is how different Gen Z is, right, to
Yep.
baby boomers.
Yep.
And the three numbers I'll give you: 66% of baby boomers believe in capitalism, 22% of Gen Z believe in capitalism,
Wow.
right? 65% of baby boomers believe working for a big company is successful, or working for a company. 76% of Gen Z want to work for themselves. Okay. But
Mm-hmm.
here's the one that is the most interesting, speaking to your portfolio career: 66% of people who have a full time job who are Gen Z also have a side hustle and side gig going,
Mm-hmm.
one or more.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so I often tell management, which tends to be baby boomers or Gen X, listen, clowns, this is not, your father's Oldsmobile. This is very, very different, this group of people. That's one. But that's not the only demographic. There's some other ones. One is that the population is declining in the United States. And the third is the population is aging in the United States. And older
Mm-hmm.
people have more money. There's obviously some pushback, and they think that older people have taken over government and all that kind of stuff. But you have basically the Gen Z thing, you have the population declining thing, and then you have the aging population who also want to work part time but not full time, partly
Yep.
because of identity, partly because they have to.
Yep.
So your entire workforce has changed. And that's one of the factors that I put in. And then I put in factors of technology and marketplaces and mindsets and side hustles. You add all of those. And then what do you hear? How do you get people back to the office? Which is not the problem at all. That you're solving for completely the wrong thing.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so a big part of it is I'm trying to remind people that the best way for a manager to no longer manage and be a leader is for them to start making, creating, and building. Because once they do that, they'll realize that what they're looking for is a guide and a coach, right?
Yep. Yep.
To apprentice from,
Yep.
and not some boss to be told what to do.
Yep. Yep.
And they will also, in doing that, even if they're a senior CEO, create a side hustle and side gig and find that it actually helps their job and it isn't some sort of like duplicitous thing where people are like stuff. And my basic belief is, hey, look, in today's world, if you can't trust your people, monitoring whether they come into the office doesn't build trust. It actually makes it worse. So get up, you clowns. Now, the good news is, because I'm an older person who used to actually be successful, I can go in and say that, and they have nobody to fire. I don't even work at Publicis. They can say, get out of the room. And I say, okay, thank you, but can I get this free Diet Coke as I leave? That's about it.
Well said. Well said. And so the answer to this may be the book, but I'm curious. And again, I'm playing off of your podcast of what's next.
Yeah.
What's next for you? Like, what is the next chapter you're building, your work you're creating?
So what I'm building, and it's one of the things, as you probably know, I've written about recently, is what I have worked on. And this, it sounds initially like I, me, mine, but I wrote a piece called A Company of One, right? And basically, I encourage every single individual, even if you're the CEO of a company, learn to operate like a company of one, right? That doesn't mean it's about I, me, mine. But if you're a company of one, here are the things you need to do. You have to basically architect, hone, and craft a skill set or skill sets of some sort, whatever they might be. Accounting, managerial, music, right? Because you have to be hired for your skill. You're not being hired for the thousands of troops you control, for the brand name of your big company. You have to be hireable by yourself. That's number one. For a company of one to actually succeed in a connected world, you have to learn how to connect and collaborate and help people and be generous. So it's not, the best way of being a company of one is thinking of the company of others, right? Which is a important thing. And the third one is you got to continuously enhance and improve your skill set, because the world is changing, and whatever you may have been successful about a company of one day doesn't make it the other day. And for all of that, you have to build your brand. But your brand is not because you're cool, but your brand should be about how you're helping other people, which is what I basically say. I help you see, think, and feel differently about, remaining relevant in transformative times, which is an interesting thing. So I said, that's what I stand for. That's what I help people. Now, if I basically said I'm about transformation, they'll say, okay, that's cool, but what's that about us, right? But I say, I'm helping you see, think, and feel differently about how to grow yourself. Okay, I'm interested. Oh, by the way, I've done it myself too. So I can maybe advise you. I've done it with companies. I can advise you. But more importantly, I am doing it now. It's not something I did 15 years ago or 10 years ago. So for me, it's basically to get to do what I'm doing, which I've sort of, and by the way, I both had a very great career and I still stay connected and I still do stuff for Publicis, right? So we have great relationships. My email still works. My Asia trip is for them. Okay, so so it's all good. So I love what I did, but there were two reasons I stopped doing that and went to a company of one. Okay, 2 or 3 reasons. And that's the other piece of advice I give people. The first is, every career has a midnight hour, and the smart people leave at 5 to 12. Okay, most people overstay their welcome. You should leave when people still think you're cool. And that's what I did all through my Publicis career. I would switch companies inside Publicis just when I thought everything was working well. It continued to work well. I said, now let me try something different, right? So that's number one. Second is, I believe success is the freedom to spend time in ways that give you joy, right? I was fortunate because of Publicis and because of my career. I was in a position where I could take risks without having to worry about the financial repercussions, which I could not when I was, bringing up my daughters and all of that, right? So my stuff is, okay, if this idiotic thing I'm doing doesn't work, I'll still be okay, right? So you have to at some stage take some risks. And so that part of taking a risk is, sooner or later, we're going to run out of time, right? And I remind people that very quickly, if you're relatively successful and depending on how much you spend, you are more likely to run out of time than you're going to run out of money. So why are you optimizing for money when the only real thing you got is time? right? So what I'm trying to do is spend more of my time in ways that give me joy, right, and that keep me basically out of trouble. So
Yeah.
that's the basic.
If all of that wasn't enough, you're also the chairman of the Tobaccowala Foundation,
Yes.
which helps over 10,000 people gain access to health and education in India. So I'm curious, do you have a story about the impact that you've seen from your efforts there that really brings to life why you prioritize that as well?
My parents, grew up in India, and they ended up doing relatively well in India for India before India's boom times, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like now, people who do well in India today do well on a global scale. They're doing well in India when I was growing up. Is you live in a great apartment, you have food, you have a car. That wasn't like modern India. You have huge amounts of wealth, but that was fantastic. But their thing always was, we have to remember they grew up poor, so they kept saying we have to give back,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so it was like in their memory that my sister and I basically created this foundation. And and what we did is we focused in a very simple way, which is we don't raise money from anybody outside.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore we spend all the money that we have, or which we earn interest on, etc. 98 cents on the dollar, or 98 paise on the rupee, goes to help people. Now,
Yeah.
in most of these things, about 20 to 30% goes for administration or fundraising,
Yeah.
and only 70% goes. In our case, 98%. The reason it isn't 100% is we have to hire an accountant, we have to hire a lawyer, and we have to have an office, and
Yeah.
that isn't free. Okay, and that doesn't go directly to the people. But to me, the big thing we also did was we actually did not launch anything new. We helped people who were already doing things but who needed a little bit more money.
Yeah.
So I'll give you two examples and how this is massively beneficial. So if you get a cornea transplant or you get a cataract solved, someone who couldn't see can see,
Mm-hmm.
right? That basically costs the equivalent of 20 US dollars. So you can
Wow.
bring someone from not seeing to seeing, from not being happy to being happy, but more important in many cases, from being unemployable to being employable
Yeah.
for $20 a head. Okay. And we've done thousands of those. So that's one. Second is, you are basically, in India, this a lot of girls don't get the same education
Yeah.
possibilities.
Yep.
But and when they do, so there's this great school for girls. But the issue basically was that the girls lived far, and their parents weren't bringing them to the school because it was too much of a distance to come to the school and back. So what we basically did is we bought buses, and we paid for bus drivers to pick everybody up from wherever they were, bring them to school, and bring them back home. Right. And so we
Wow.
educated hundreds of people. So I didn't create the school. We just solved that. I didn't
Yeah.
create the cornea transplant. We solved for that. And so, in effect, those are the differences, which is we get people. The way I look at it is everything we do is about illumination,
Mm.
right? So, illumination either through education, so you can, learn, so you're enlightened.
Yep.
Illumination through getting sight back, which is you're sort of enlightened because of that.
Yeah.
And then the third one is we sort of illuminate what seem to be like darker days in people's lives. So we do stuff for old people homes. So for instance, I grew up in a Jesuit school, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what I began to realize that these nuns and fathers were human beings too. It took me some time to figure it out that they actually wore real clothes under all their cassocks, right? Which initially was a shock. Oh my God,
Yeah.
these are real people. But what happens is they live on school property. What happens when they get old? Where do they go live?
Mm.
Okay. So we figured out that there was a place that actually had place for these people. And so we funded that. So in effect, not the people who exactly educated me, but people who educated people like me, we made sure that they had a place to stay when they were in their last 10 years of their life. Right.
Wow.
And that was illuminating or reducing some of the burden, having them a good end life kind of thing. So those are the ways we choose it. It's all about illumination.
Yeah.
Um, and as you can see, I'm actually using business strategy, targeting,
Yeah.
marketing,
Yeah.
right? In
Yeah.
that, right, where we are not making money, but we're giving away money.
Yeah.
But there's a return on investment there, which is probably higher than in most other cases that I do stuff.
100%. 100%. So I'm going to switch to your personal brand for a moment. What would you say is your superpower?
So my superpower is reinvention,
Mm.
okay, and helping people reinvent. And so that's my sort of one word positioning is reinvent.
Mm-hmm.
But how I do that is three. So I'm a reinventor, but if I were looking at, okay, what are the muscles that allow you to do that, right? Or what are the things that let you actually do that, or foods?
Mm-hmm.
And one is the joy of continuous learning,
Mm-hmm.
which allows me to do the second one, which is connect dots in new ways.
Mm-hmm.
And then allows me to do the third one is tell stories that simplify without dumbing down.
Mm.
Okay. So the whole idea basically is first I got to have lots of dots. I got to learn.
Yep.
Then, and so like this morning, someone basically said, "What are you reading?" And I said, "Well, I read multiple books at the same time, but right now I'm reading 4 of the 6 Booker finalists.
Mm.
Right? I'm basically reading this Pulitzer Prize winning, book, which is off sort of David Copperfield. I started reading, uh, Daniel Close, who's the amazing graphic artist, his new masterpiece called Monica,
Mm.
right? And and then I'm reading a couple of nonfiction books because these are guests who are coming in to my podcast.
Yeah.
And I just read. I spend an hour a day reading all this other, an hour and a half a day just reading that. That's dots, but then I connect them. But by the way, because I'm reading other people and I'm listening to other people, in the back of my mind, I'm taking notes. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
that's a good way of doing things, and that's a
Mm-hmm.
way of doing things. And so people are always saying like, when you go to conferences, you're sitting there and you're listening to everybody else, unlike other speakers who come in and go. I said, well, I can learn. But
Yeah.
I said, I'm trying to learn 2 things there. I'm trying to learn what they're trying to say, which is the content, but I'm
Mm-hmm.
trying to see if I can say it in better ways. Not that
Mm.
I can say their stuff in better ways, but are they doing things that I've never thought about that I should
Yeah.
start using myself? And so my whole basic belief is if you aren't constantly learning and benchmarking, what the hell? So that's what I end up, and that allows me to do the reinvention.
Yeah. No, that's one. That's an amazing superpower to have. But then two, the way you've been able to make it repeatable,
Right.
and
And
something that,
apply to very different places and different parts of my career, right?
yeah.
And that is the key thing that I'll tell you that for those for people who have bosses and who have
Mm-hmm.
leaders and who have clients, and almost all of us have bosses, leaders, and clients. And even if you think you don't have a boss, you have a partner who's your boss. Okay.
Yep.
But so there's always somebody there. But let's say you've got a client, a marketing client. Say you're in an agency, you've got an agency boss, or you've got a client, you're a supplier, you're a tech platform, whoever you are. What I will tell you is there are 3 things that everyone is grappling with. And number 3, not number 1, number 3 is what are the new business models and ways of working in the world we live in?
Mm.
Right? So is my
Yep.
business model correct? I got AI, I got Web3, I got digital, God knows. So that's right. Um, those are things that Visa is worried about. Like,
Yep.
what's the future of money? What's blockchain? What's this? What's that? Okay.
Yep.
The second is, do I have the right? So do I have the right business model? Then is, do I have the right suppliers, talent, and organizational design? So that's
Mm-hmm.
internal.
Yep.
But if you feed them enough, I don't know, popcorn or alcohol, right? This is the one that everyone is worried about. Am I still relevant?
Mm.
And the more senior you get, there's much more angst, right?
Yep.
Than for younger people.
Yep.
And that is because you have to unlearn stuff. You stopped learning stuff,
Yep.
right? And most of them play buzzword bingo, which is they basically put out these big fat words, which I don't understand. So I say, can you explain to me what you just said? And they say, well, you're a digital expert, you're an AI expert, you should understand this shit. I said, I have no clue what you talked about because you're talking now in code and this language, and I don't know what you're talking about. Let me can we just talk about this in English? And they
Yeah.
find it very difficult, some of them. Not because they
Right.
aren't world class, they're world class players, right? But Just imagine how fast the world has changed. The fact simply is that when somebody today asks me anything about digital, or like asked me like 5, 7 years ago about digital, I said, I don't know.
Yep.
Right. And they'd say, what are you talking about? You've been working at this for 20 years. Right. But I said, I stopped being a practitioner a long time ago. I
Hmm.
then stopped running things a long time ago. So I can't tell you anything.
Yep.
Right. And then they said, but you were closer to it than I am today. So I said, therefore, you should make sure you have got either you delegate well, which is what I used to do, and then get people to come and ask you problems you can solve. So, if I would tend to solve problems that had nothing to do with the field, I knew enough about the field. So if someone could like I was not completely weird. I had no idea, but I was solving more of the problem as, okay, how do you deal with this difficult client? Okay.
Mm.
Okay. One of the other people in the agency is fighting with you. Like, how do you like calm things down? Right.
Yep. Yep.
Those kinds of stuff.
Yep. Yep. So, have you had a "Mama, we made it" moment?
I don't think, mom. I think, look, the three mama we, yes. So we have many of those. And interestingly, the first was when I got a job,
Mm.
right? Like I had no
Hmm.
job, I had a job. And by the way, you know, I've had both our daughters for reasons that had nothing to do with them and who are extremely talented. In this past year, both of them lost jobs and then got jobs back again.
Hmm.
Okay.
Hmm.
And they appreciated what having a job was. I mean, they enjoyed their jobs, right? But one of
Yeah.
them got musked by Elon Musk when he came and
Hmm.
got rid of 6,000 people at Twitter. And one of them is in the movie business, and
Mm.
the writer's strike got her like, and everybody else in the movie business receiving unemployment checks.
Yeah.
Okay. And so my whole stuff is like, I always tell people, I know your job is like difficult, but you got yourself a job. I'm not saying take anything, but
Yeah.
getting a job is an aha moment for me. It was. So
Yeah.
that's number one. The second aha moment, really, which was like, okay, here's a really interesting, is it basically happened when I started to be allowed to do things without too much data to support it. When I started
Mm.
launching things like Giant Step and others, right? That I'd earned enough trust with people. They said, okay, you're trying to take us to places where there's no backward looking data, but we trust you and you let us know if we're making mistakes, which I did. Often I was making the mistake and I came back and said,
Yeah.
I think we went off in the wrong direction. And then the third one was more of a financial thing, like when Publicis when bought Leo Burnett, right?
Hmm.
So at that particular stage, I said, okay, now I don't have to worry about tuition and things like that, which
Yeah.
I started to work. And I think the most recent one was 4.5 years ago, which has now become very clear to me when I took this jump of saying, okay, I'm going to stop working full time at Publicis. I'm just going to be an advisor, like an emeritus professor for however long that lasts. And I'm going to be by myself as a company of one. And, my wife basically says, no one's going to call you because you're not working for a 95,000 person company. You're going to be feeling lonely because you're losing your community. So I've solved for that. I solved for a lot of those things.
Yeah.
Um, and you're just going to have no identity. I said, no, I'm an author. That's my identity, those kinds of stuff. But her whole stuff was like, I don't know about this. Okay. And it turned out that I obviously loved what I did at Publicis and I couldn't have done this, but I'm having as much, if not more fun,
Yeah.
right, than I was having then. And that's primarily because in your best jobs, the best jobs you enjoy 70% of the time.
Hmm.
Okay. I've always told people that. And 30% of the time is questionable. And about 10% of the 30% or 10% of the overall time, it's deeply suspect whether you want to like stay in the company. Right.
Yeah.
And this
Yeah.
happens to the best at the highest levels. And the reason is because there are things called competition, clients, compensation, budgets, P&Ls, right?
Yeah.
Things go wrong in the night. People misbehave. All kinds
Yep.
of weird shit
Yep.
happens. You lose pitches.
Yep.
All kinds of things happen. And so my thing was, okay, how do I get rid of the 30%? Right? And I figured out how to get rid of the 30%. But the way to get rid of the 30% is to have no clients, have no bosses, and have nobody reporting to you. So now I'm a company of one. But it works.
That's great. That's great. So I want to close this out and hopefully have a little bit of
Sure.
fun. When they turned your life story into a movie, who would you want to play you on the big screen?
The one that I'd like to play me is two different, and I'm going to write about this Saturday
Okay.
in my Substack or Sunday, I think. So one of them is someone who doesn't look like me, but who's an amazing actor, is an Indian guy called Shah Rukh Khan, who's like India's biggest actor. So it's the equivalent of, I would say, George Clooney, Brad Pitt, all combined into one. But
Okay.
but he's very good. And then I don't know the name of this person, but this past week I saw this amazing movie which I've been recommending to people, but it's still in the festival circuit, called I Am Dancer, which is
Mhm.
about this young Indian street dancer who wants to be a
Hmm.
dancer, and everybody says you're an acrobat, right? And how he transforms and reinvents his life around his passion over,
Hmm.
and the movie follows it over 6 years in 4 countries. He's amazing. So
Wow.
that would be good.
What song would play in your trailer?
Times they are changing.
So I'm a huge fan of stories. It's why I do the podcast. My last name doesn't hurt.
Right.
But if you had the chance to sit with three people, they could be with us, they could have passed on, and hear their story firsthand, who would be your three?
I would say the three that I would love to hear from is what is who I consider to be the best storyteller of all time, who I know who actually lived. So I'm not using a religious person because they were great storytellers, but I'm not exactly sure how to is William Shakespeare.
Hmm.
Okay. Because William Shakespeare probably understood more about life and human beings, and probably has written more books read by more people than probably, excepting for the big books of the religions,
Hmm.
uh, is William Shakespeare, or has affected other writers, ways of looking at things, etc. So I think
Yep.
it would be there for one, clearly one. The second one, to a great extent, besides William Shakespeare, would be Martin Luther King.
Hmm.
Um, and the reason for Martin Luther King is that most recently reading this amazing biography called King, which is right behind me, which has just come out. It's the first biography on Martin Luther King after like 25, 30 years, but it's a lot of new material, because part of it is all his FBI files, and all of those have been sort of released, right?
Hmm.
And what the idea basically is, people don't realize how complex he was, right? And how
Right.
extraordinary he was.
Yeah.
So there's the complexity that there were certain things in his personal life that were somewhat, suspect in
Yep.
today's world,
Yep.
but also the bravery and what he did and how he did it,
Yep.
right? It's an amazing story, but at the very same time, you see sort of America changing.
Yep.
But at the very same stage, you say, wait, this is some of the same stuff that happened 2 years ago.
Hmm.
And then you look at the book date and it's 1950s, 1960s, right?
Yeah.
So it's this amazing thing about the history. And, you have everyone from Muhammad Ali show up, and the Harry Belafonte, and, all of these
Hmm.
people sort of connected. It's extraordinary. So I would say that would be second one. And the third one is Taylor Swift, uh, who I basically I'm in awe of her,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
I'm not only in awe of her because, like, of her business acumen and her impact, but what I think is true with Shakespeare, but I'm not sure, but you can see it in his writing. Definitely true about Martin Luther King, and extremely true about Taylor Swift. Is, to me, there are three big things that they all are the same. One is a quest for absolute excellence,
Mm.
right?
Yep.
Which is number one. Second is courage to take massive risks.
Hmm.
Like when Shakespeare was writing, the way he was writing was completely different. And he did, plays and sonnets and everything,
Yeah.
which is the same with, Taylor Swift, everything from, going from Nashville to LA and things like that. But this is the third one. And this is the one that is the hardest today, and the one that I remind people that leadership is not only about power. It's not just about courage. It's not just about taking risks, right?
Hmm.
But it's about doing the right thing,
Hmm.
even if it costs you.
Hmm.
Okay. And very few people are willing to do the right thing, even if it costs you. And, in effect, you may not know this, and I'm not saying anything about, Taylor's uh, political standings. Okay.
Yeah. Yep.
But, her stuff was, hey, look, everybody needs to have a voice.
Hmm.
Okay. So for National Voters Registration Day, please sign up here. And I don't know,
Yep.
350,000 people sign up or something like
Yep.
that, right?
Yep.
And people say, okay, she's signing up. But you go back, so people say who she has a voice for, right?
Yeah.
Well, immediately after Charlotte, read her tweet
Yeah.
to Trump, right?
Yeah.
At what she basically said. And so when my whole stuff is that is what I call, so those are so the commonality besides they're extraordinary people, right? But you've also noticed when I've put together three people from three different eras,
Mm-hmm.
very different backgrounds,
Mm-hmm.
men and women,
Mm-hmm.
people of color, people not of color.
Yeah.
Because to me, that always makes a very good table.
So, is there anything I didn't ask that you want to share, or anything you want to ask me?
Two things really. One is, how the hell did you hang out as a talented person with all the people you were working with and myself? Because I mean, I'm sure you may have said like, what clown car did I get myself into?
I would say the easiest answer is when someone comes to you when you live in Cincinnati, Ohio, and they offer you the opportunity to move to Los Angeles to work in the emerging space of where the industry is going. It's hard to say no. And then
Right.
when you get there and you actually get to do the stuff they said you were going to get to do, you stick around. And so I would say that I took a leap of faith, and it delivered in spades. And I can honestly say the things you taught us, the things Sunil, Tim Harris, on and on
Right.
and on down the list that I learned in that time, they still guide how I operate today. And hopefully I'm able to pass it on to the people I get to work with and the people I get to sit alongside, because there was something in the water that
Yeah.
when I was drinking, I didn't realize it, but as I moved on and learned more, it was a very special time.
Absolutely. Well, we were lucky to have you, and they were lucky to have you. And as you know, the other thing that's amazing is all of us remain connected. That's the thing that
Mm-hmm.
people find extraordinary. They say, wait, all these people who used to work for you 25, 30 years ago, you'll talk all the time. Like I
Yep.
said, I don't talk to them as much as they talk to each other, which is
Yep.
clearly, I'd go crazy. And obviously because I'm older and all of that, but because there were also pretty generational differences between them and us or me.
Yep.
Uh, but what tends to basically happen is, and I would say if there's one thing that you've taken away, which I would elucidate to everybody else, is people say this, but people don't realize how true it is. You're only as good as the people that surround you,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Mm-hmm.
part of it is sometimes they will tell you you're not so good, so don't panic. Just learn from it. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Because the one thing that all the people you learn from, you would tell them that, but they would tell that to
Mm-hmm.
you. Right.
Yep.
And, I had in my podcast, I had this lady from Kim Scott who wrote Radical Candor. And,
Mm-hmm.
her whole stuff is you got to show people that you care about them
Yep.
and you want them to improve. And that's good feedback. But if you don't care or you don't want them to improve, then that's bad feedback.
Yeah. It's the difference between being nice and being kind.
Yeah, exactly.
Being nice, you tell them what they want to hear. Being kind,
Yes.
you tell them what they need to hear.
Exactly.
And there was a lot of kindness in those days.
there was a lot of kindness and a lot of, I would say, alcohol to after the kindness was delivered. But that's the way it was. But thank you, Matt.
Thank you. Before I let you go, if people want to follow, they want to keep
Sure.
up with what you're up to, where should I send them?
So the best place is really to read my writing is rishad.substack.com. That's my free email, and they just go in and it's free. And then the other one is that they go to my website, which is rishadtobaccowala.com, and
Mhm.
add /, which is the sign below the question mark, 100. I've taken the best of all my writing and culled it on one page
Hmm.
with, it's in 12 different subjects. So there's one section, how to manage your career. Another one is how to manage people. A third is how
Hmm.
to learn.
Hmm.
And that is very popular, and it's all free and it's always available, and I constantly curate it. Uh, and it's one of the big things that I basically learned, that the more you help people and you're generous, that becomes the way you build a brand, which a lot of people forget. They believe it's about keeping, and I basically believe you give a lot. And it's like that Eric Clapton song, plant your love and let it grow.
Yeah.
So that's the other thing I would remind people is, if you know something cool, share it with people. Don't hoard it,
Yep.
because there's other cool stuff you can learn.
Well, thank you for being generous with your time. Thank you for being generous with your stories. It's been so great to hear all the things that you've touched, and also just to reminisce on some of those golden years for me.
Yes.
And just I'll continue to follow, look forward to the book, and
Sure.
just thank you.
Welcome. Thank you.
Until next time, I encourage you, as always, to continue to share your story. It's so important, not only for you, but for others to hear your story. And if you have any feedback or any comments about any of the podcasts, feel free to reach out to me. You can reach me at all of the social channels at Matt E. Story, or you can go to my website, www.mattestory.com.